Hi, my name is Christopher Malcolm, and welcome to Movable Canvas, where we talk about the movies and what makes a good movie into a great film. Today, we travel back to 1970 and have a look at Hal Ashby's overlooked masterpiece, The Landlord. Like most young people, when I began my journey to become a filmmaker, the very first thing I did was just devour every movie that had ever been made. Whether it was a black and white movie from classic Hollywood or a movie from the 1970s and the auteur period, to even a Hollywood blockbuster, if it had been on celluloid, I wanted to have seen it. If there was an actor or a director or a cinematographer who had ever had their name published in Variety or Hollywood Reporter, I wanted to make sure to commit that name to memory. And of course, full of all this confidence and thinking that I was now some kind of cinephile genius, I had no hesitation in calling myself a film buff. So it was in this state of kind of blissful ignorance that I walked into a UCLA producing class. There was a guest speaker that day. And one of the perks of living in Hollywood is that your guest speakers tend to be pretty good. They tend to be names that most people only see in the credits of movies. And in here in LA, you get to see them just on a regular basis. It's a great way to not only make connections, but also to get to know people, really pick their brain and ask them questions directly to build your knowledge of both filmmaking and the art form itself. I don't actually remember the producer's name, but I do remember his first question. I don't think I'll ever forget it. He stood up in front of the class, and the first thing he said is, "Okay, by a show of hands, who here knows the name Hal Ashby?" I was stumped. I didn't know if he was talking about some new Hollywood leading man or the guy who parked his car on the way into the studio. My overconfidence really should have just been punctured immediately, but the blow was softened a little bit by the fact that in a room full of about 50 students, I don't think anybody else raised their hand either. And since this is not the first time he had asked that question, and since this is not the first time he'd gotten kind of a blank stare as a response, he followed up quickly with what would become to be a very obvious thing, which is if you don't know the name Hal Ashby, you really should be ashamed of yourself. He also pointed out to us young knuckleheads that if we were ever fortunate enough to be in a room with the likes of Martin Scorsese or Robert De Niro, and we admitted to the fact that we didn't know who Hal Ashby was, we'd probably find ourselves quickly being booted straight out of the room. Being young, foolish, and somewhat embarrassed by the fact that this man had just exposed my lack of knowledge, my first thing to do was be upset with the messenger. I mean, who is this Hal Ashby guy? He clearly can't be that important if I don't know who he is. Boy, was I an idiot. So right after class, the very first thing I did was drive straight over to the video store to pick up the VHS. Yeah, I'm old. Yeah, you see, back in the olden days, if we wanted to see a movie, we had to go to the store and just Google it. But there I was, marching up and down the aisle, picking out titles like Shampoo, Being There, Harold and Maude, Bound for Glory. And in the course of one long weekend, I went from kind of overconfident film geek to a guy who really was embarrassed that up to that point I didn't know who Hal Ashby was. I mean, really, how did I not know his name? I mean, how does anyone not know his name? I mean, in an industry where hits can be few and far between, Hal Ashby literally went a full decade making nothing but the greatest movies of all time. The Landlord, 1970. Harold and Maude, 1971. The Last Detail, 1973. I Am the Goddamn Motherfucking Shore Patrol, Motherfucker. It's not a very good Jack Nicholson. Shampoo, 1975. Bound for Glory, 1976. And Being There, 1979. I like to watch. It's funnier when Peter Sellers says it. I mean, really, the guest speaker was right. I needed to be ashamed of myself. Of course, as thorough as the video store was by my house, just on the other side of the freeway overpass, it still didn't have every Hal Ashby movie. Movies like Harold and Maude or Shampoo, you could pretty much find those on racks anywhere in the country. But it wasn't until one lazy Sunday afternoon and a kind of a refusal to leave the couch ended up in an unintentional movie marathon on TCM that I ended up seeing what's my favorite Hal Ashby film and really kind of one of my favorite movies of all time, which is called The Landlord. The Landlord was Hal Ashby's directorial debut after already having had a successful career as an editor on such films as In the Heat of the Night and The Thomas Crown Affair. For his debut film, he chose to make a somewhat quirky comedy about a upstate blue blood who decides to move into the city into a mostly African-American neighborhood and kind of get started on gentrification a little bit early. His goal is to flip the property into something nice, but of course he has one tiny problem: the tenants. And even though the son would be what I guess would be called in today's terms maybe the most woke member of the family, he's still not quite ready for quite such a colorful community. Yes, that was a double entendre. The residents of the tenement building include the legendary Pearl Bailey, Lou Gossett Jr. far before he became famous from An Officer and a Gentleman, and Diana Sands, who gives one of the best performances of the 1970s and one of the most probably overlooked in the role of the one tenant that Bridges' character kind of grows the closest to. And while the only person of color present in Bridges' real life back home in upstate New York is probably the butler, the cast of characters there is still just as colorful. You see what I did there? It's another double entendre, right? You get it. Most of that color came from Lee Grant, who Hal Ashby had worked with on In the Heat of the Night. While in real life she was only 16 years older than Bridges, in the film she plays this kind of wacky, zany mother, and she plays it so well that she ended up with an Academy Award nomination. There's a scene later in the film between Lee Grant and Pearl Bailey where they get into the pot liquor, and yeah, that's worth the price of admission by itself. But while you will find yourself laughing hysterically throughout most of the film's hour and 52-minute running time, you'll find that the film is a lot more than just punchlines. Actually, in fact, you'll find that Hal Ashby's whole career is about more than just punchlines. Even though films like this, or Harold and Maude, or Shampoo have more than enough punchlines to keep a smile on your face, you'll also find that they have something interesting and potent to say. Harold and Maude talking about kind of the base of human connection. Shampoo discussing kind of the feeling of emptiness and the feeling of helplessness in our own lives. The Landlord, perhaps to the detriment of its kind of commercial outlook, dives straight into race relations. But before you hit the stop button and just decide not to watch the movie, keep in mind that it does so without having to preach to you. It does so without having to give you a big grand lecture. It does so simply by telling you a story and letting you come to your own conclusion. Hal Ashby does this by giving us well-rounded characters. It's not one of those movies where they try to dispel a stereotype by making a movie full of stereotypes. In fact, what makes The Landlord so brilliant is that for most of his running time, you won't really realize that there's a message to the movie at all. Instead, Ashby provides us with a film that, on its surface, is nothing more than an absurdist comedy. But he's able to reach deeper than just comedy by populating this absurdist world with actually real people. Heightened versions of real people, to be sure, but real people. When the former editor turned director decides to stage a party scene later in the film, among the black tenants of his building, some of the grievances aired during the party are real. Not real in the way that all of us have heard 10 million times before, but real and subtle in a way that shows that the filmmakers really took the time to understand the characters that they were showing on screen, both the black characters and the white characters, and to give them lived-in lives and real experiences that aren't the type of things that you're usually going to see on screen. Then later in the film, there's another kind of party among Bridges' white family and the type of people that we do not see living in the African-American tenement. And while this party is just as absurd and just as crazy as the other one, it too is kind of based in real things. The punchlines, they seem crazy, but there are things that people actually do, and some people still do to this day, and really shouldn't still be doing. But it's that kind of connectivity to real life is what separates the comedy from being just punchline, 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 and really makes it it makes a story into whole cloth, and allows viewers to both connect emotionally and mentally, and actually get something out of it while just, kind of laughing your butt off at the same time. Bridges' relationship with the Diana Sands character is both kind of the comedic and dramatic heart of the film. Although the stuff that comes out of their relationship is not only funny or alternately funny and sweet, but it's also very organic to the situation and organic to the characters, therefore making it feel even more real, making both the drama and the comedy hit home even that much harder. And so what happens with the movie, as happens in many of Hal Ashby's films, is that you spend almost 2 hours laughing yourself hoarse, thinking you've just seen the most absurd thing you've ever seen in life, and then At a certain point as you're walking out during the credits, it dawns on you like, wait a minute, that movie actually had something to say. It takes a special filmmaker to engage an audience both emotionally and mentally, and Hal Ashby's ability to do that time and time again is what makes him one of the greatest filmmakers to ever live. And I am still embarrassed to this day that there was a time when I didn't know his name. So what do you think? Have you ever seen The Landlord? What's your favorite Hal Ashby movie? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. And thanks for watching Movable Canvas, where we talk about the movies and what takes a good movie and makes it into a great film. Thanks for watching.